We're going to talk about agricultural crop maps, and also I'm still looking over how you guys completed the survey on things to review. And one of the things a lot of people wanted to see was a lot of review on maps, and I kind of figured that. Now, I do understand that with the format of the test this year only, they're not going to ask you to identify places on maps nearly as much, if at all. But what they're going to do is they very well may ask you to explain the pattern, explain the distribution pattern, or explain or describe why that pattern exists. I think that's the things when we study maps. Why does this religion dominate here? Why does this religion dominate here? Why does this language dominate here? Why is this crop grown here? That's what you guys need a lot of practice with. And then what consequences does that have? How does that impact the environment? How does that impact politics? How does it impact world trade? Sustainability, excuse me, that kind of thing. So we're going to look at some maps, and we can look through tons of maps, guys, but I'm going to pick some here to look at. You need to look at as many as possible. When you feel like you're pretty comfortable with it, then, again, it'll help you understand how many more you need to look at. Here's a map of U.S. winter wheat. Remember, winter wheat, and here's the big spot, the grain country, Midwest, our breadbasket. Winter wheat is planted right before the winter because it doesn't get real cold out here, so it can survive and stay dormant. Remember, up here is mostly spring wheat because it's too cold. Now, there is a little winter wheat grown out in Washington, which is another big wheat state. Climate's a little bit milder out there, okay? But what does all this mean? Well, why is there winter wheat there? Well, one, it's great ground for producing wheat. Two, we eat a lot of it. Three, we sell it around the world. And also, the land is relatively cheap, and wheat growing is an extensive agricultural activity. Extensive, further away from the ring. So big commercial farms can buy a whole lot of land and mass produce this stuff. That's the kind of thinking we've got to go through. You also could be thinking about what would people criticize about? Excuse me, can't get throat cleared. What would people criticize about this type of commercial agriculture? Think about the disappearance of family farms. Think about how it's affected demographics. The older population here as younger people move out. There's a lot of things impacted. So that's the kind of questions they will ask you about. Scroll on down, you see the Corn Belt. We know the Corn Belt. We've talked about it a lot. It's a formal region. It's an area where obviously a lot of the nation's corn is grown. It's great soil for growing corn. Corn's valuable, but not just for us to eat. Remember why they grow most of this corn? To feed cattle and pigs, to fatten them up for slaughter, because what are we going to pay more for? Corn or a steak? We all know the answer to that. And so therefore the high demand of that has to do with corn production is impacted. They want the feedlots where they feed the animals to be near this area right here. This is hard to see some of these, but sorghum production, you can tell where it does well in more humid southern areas of the drier land of the American Great Plains. Soybeans. Notice how soybeans correlate with corn and also rice a little bit. What's that tell us? Well, yes, it can grow in that soil. It's also valuable to feed to some animals, but there's something else about soybeans. Soybeans are used a lot where corn is because soybeans can be grown in the same ground and give nutrients to the soil that corn needs, and vice versa. That's something else, again, we can get double cropping kind of idea from this. Beef cows, you see that in the United States. We're going to look at world maps in a minute. But in the U.S., remember, this is ranching country. This is grain and mixed crop and livestock country over here. And there's more dots over here. Test yourself. Why? Dots are even thicker over here than they are over here. And this is livestock ranching. Why? Because this is marginal land. There's not a lot of people out here. So cattle are running over a large range of places. These are feedlot-like areas. Cattle are densely packed together. They're often sent from here to here when they get ready to kill them. And places like Tennessee and Kentucky, you have some feedlot production, but you also have farms that are a whole lot smaller. So the cattle are a lot more densely populated. So it's really important to break these down in that way. This is one of dairy cattle. You'll see real easily on this one, the Great Lakes, upstate New York, this area of dairy production. Remember, used to it was all around the country. Now it's clustered here and There's California. This milk serves this part of the country. This milk serves most of the rest. Because with refrigerated trucks, better roads, milk from these two areas, think about it. If you're producing milk in this area, how long does it take to get to the rest of this part of the country? Day and a half, probably. And then California takes care of the rest. That's why, for example, think about how expensive milk might be, or even gas for that matter, in Hawaii. You see why? Because of the transport cost that has to come in. That's the big thing about von Thunen's model that still matters, is transport cost does play a role. Here's cotton production in the United States, upland cotton. What would this tell us about cotton? You know the history of cotton probably in this country. What kind of climate? Warm, subtropical, doesn't grow in cold weather. That's pretty obvious. So you can see that. So then you can figure out across the globe where cotton can be grown. Is cotton likely to be grown in Russia or India? Based on what you see here, that should be an easy answer. Is most of Russia more equivalent to the American Deep South, or is India going to be more climate equivalent to the Deep South? And India is your answer. There might be some places in Africa, and there are, in kind of Central Africa, where you can grow cotton. So that's the kind of things you take from these maps. And also then, of course, you could correlate this map very similar to the history of slavery in the United States and the African-American population. Here's a map of hog and pig production in the United States, okay? Hog and pig production. And notice the feedlot area, plus, always the exceptions, North Carolina. There's been a clustering of hog production there for a very long time. It's a big place for that. You get a lot of fresh sausage and pork and all that kind of stuff. But they're typically growing the pigs, raising the pigs where they've got a lot of feed for them. Here's the broiler. Broilers are chickens, right? Broiler chickens. Look where chickens are concentrated across the country. Notice in California, probably serving the West Coast, but this is not in Hollywood. This is in the Valley. Some of you probably get a laugh out of that one. But this is in the Valley, north toward the east there. And then the Deep South and Arkansas, famous. If you've ever been to Arkansas, there's plenty of chickens. Chickens everywhere. All right? Chickens don't need even the land that cows need. Chickens they can scoop around. They can make it on anything, side of a mountain, whatever. So land that's not valuable for much else, people often raise chickens. That's why you find the South, which has traditionally been poorer than a lot of the country, has a large chicken growing area. And we have a chicken plant just down the road here in Morristown, a couple of them actually. And of course, a lot of those chickens come from chicken farms across the Southeast. Not that many in Tennessee, actually. They're coming a lot of times from other states. Here's another map of chicken production, looks similar. Here's a map of cow and calf density in the United States. Remember, this is predominantly about beef cattle. As you can see, the parts of the country, grain country, livestock ranching in the feed and livestock area. And then we got a few others here. Here is one for hay, which is obviously used to feed the animals, horses, cattle. And this is rice production. This is very clustered along the Mississippi River. Okay. Apple production is concentrated in, you can tell cool weather is good for apple production. New York, the Big Apple, think about it that way. Washington, famous for apples. So just like cotton needs that warmer weather, apples need the cooler weather. Then here's another one of cattle and the density. These are actually slaughter establishments, slaughterhouses. Slaughterhouses are going to be near, clustered, associated spatially, near places of cattle fattening. And we have, matter of fact, it was in the news, world news here a couple of years ago, a major slaughterhouse in East Tennessee in Granger County that got shut down and raided by ICE and all that. You may remember that from a few years ago, many stories about that. They're actually reopened now. They're not operating at the same capacity they used to, but I live in Granger County, and I did not realize that place was one of the largest slaughterhouses in the South. And I assume one of these right here, probably that one, is that slaughterhouse. But they were killing, I think 400 or 500 animals a day, and that's a major production. I want to show you a few more maps. We may divide this into 2 different videos to make it a little more, a little easier to navigate. But don't forget, you need to review crop hearth maps. The video from several days ago, but go back to last week. The YouTube video I linked about crop hearths, maybe early last week, is going to be great to help you. Like, you may be looking at things like, and the good news is for this test this year, I don't think they're going to be trivial questions. You can look those up. But let's say they ask you, how would you discuss how wheat might have spread to this part of the world? It's diffusion. If you know that wheat basically had a hearth in Mesopotamia, then you can explain how probably maybe the Greeks were growing wheat a few hundred years later and how it was probably contagious diffusion that took place along the way. So I wouldn't spend a ton of time on the crop hearth map, but I would familiarize myself with them and compare them to maps like this. Cultural hearth, because you can't have an agricultural hearth unless you have a cultural hearth. And then you might also take a quick look at these that actually list major crop hearths and where animals were domesticated in different parts of the world at different times. Might take a look at that. And then there's some other maps on here as well. Here's one of livestock ranching. I think this would be a beneficial one. And there's, by the way, there's some really good crop maps I'm about to show you that are in your book. I think this one's in your book. Major cattle producing. You need to know, where else are a lot of cattle raised besides the United States? And here's something that I would like for you to think about. Who would be more likely to be raising cattle, even if you were not looking at this map? Belgium or Argentina? Raising cattle on grass, ranching. Now, while both places have a climate that is suitable to do that, and both could have grasslands, which, by the way, that's important. You need grass for the cattle to eat. What makes Argentina a much better answer and Belgium almost a silly one? Now, yes, there are cattle in Europe, and you see that, but there's not many in Belgium. Urban growth and population density means that cattle are not going to be you can't afford to raise cattle on land that people are putting high-rise apartments on. You're not going to make enough money. Whereas Argentina is a bigger place with more rural areas. So you're not going to have many cattle raised in Belgium, but you are going to have a lot of cattle raised in South America in places like Argentina. Don't forget these maps from last week. Subsistence agriculture in your LDCs, less developed countries. And then MDCs are your commercial agriculture. Animal hearth, this is a good one to look at. Where do we think dogs, pigs, sheep, horses, cows came from? It's rather simple. Most of them came from Mesopotamia, it's believed. Horses from Central Asia, like the kind of remember the Kurgan hearth theory, and where Indo-European language come from, maybe the same area. And then it's believed cattle come from India. How easy is that to remember, right? Thinking about the Hindus and what they believe about cattle. And then there's several other good maps. Where is wheat grown in the world? And I need to make these a little larger, but look at the latitudinal connection of where wheat is grown. You can tell there's a climate zone. You can also go up here and see net grain importers and exporters. Who sells more, who buys more. The U.S. is a major exporter of a lot of food, but particularly grains. Then this is a good map of cattle production in the world or livestock production. They give the type of animal. Notice camel in the Middle East. Please take a look at these. I mean, I could go over them over and over, but I'm going to let you kind of modify that based on what you need. Also, here's another great map. I think this one may be in your book of agricultural zones. Try to match those up and explain why. Here's another one down here of beef markets and consumers in the world, explaining what areas eat a lot of meat. Obviously, some don't. Buddhists don't eat as much meat, so that's going to be a change. Energy sources and producing food, energy sources such as maize, rice, and wheat. What areas of the world are leaders in that? This actually comes from your textbook. You'll see that China produces rice, obviously at a large level, whereas some other crops are produced in Central Africa, like some root crops. Protein, the United States is famous for protein. Just think about meat eaters and producing meat. You can tell that Argentina and Brazil also have a lot of animals as far as livestock in Europe, and they're wealthier places on the whole. Percent protein from meat. In other words, there are other ways we get protein. America is famous for getting a lot of it from the meat we eat. Calories we eat per day. This also is essential because it helps us understand Certain foods are obviously higher in calories. So those foods that are produced in the rich world are going to give us that larger intake, where the poorer countries in the world that don't eat as much meat are going to have a harder time getting their calories. Percent of income spent on food. Now, this is very good. Notice how little that America spends on food. I'm not saying we don't eat much. We all know we do. I know I do. But we don't spend a lot because our commercial farms produce it at such a cheap rate. Notice places in the world that are spending 40% or more of their income on food. Now, some Americans do spend more on food. Americans who live in what we call food deserts, which we'll talk about here in a couple days. But in poorer parts of the world where they're not mass producing food, they have to spend more of their income on food and therefore can't spend it on other things. And that's a challenge, and that's a problem, right? Percent, then compare that to undernourishment, people not getting proper caloric intake. It matches up. A lot of people in India, a lot of people in Southeast Asia, a lot of people in Sub-Saharan Africa, and some in parts of, and this is not updated, but Venezuela would probably be higher on this list today. Also the islands like Haiti, places like that. This is showing undernourished population in the world. And you can see what's happened to it over time. It has increased. This is not percentage. This is total number of people. So this is going to reflect a lot of population growth. If we said percentage of people who are undernourished, Sub-Saharan Africa's would be going down. But it's going up because it's total number of people and the population is growing. Hopefully that makes sense. Climate regions is a good study too, because this will help you explain why certain crops are grown in certain places. So take a look at that map. This is all under World Crop Maps in OneNote under Content Library and Agriculture. Notice what has happened to food production, the blue line. Notice what's happened to population. And notice how basically the technocrats have been right. Bozarup has been mostly right. The blue line represents food per person. Notice how pretty consistent this has been. We're finding ways, as the technocrats said, so far, to produce food. Now, the neo-Malthusians would say, not so fast. You've only done it to this point, and you're basically causing major problems with the way you're farming today. You're killing the soil, you're contaminating, you're polluting, the carbon emissions. You're not going to be able to keep it up. It's not sustainable. And they would say there's still going to be problems. By the way, I need to throw in, and it really needs to go in your notes, commercial farmers also face challenges. We said subsistence farmers do, but so do commercial farmers. Their challenges are really low prices. They're so good at what they do. They're producing so much that prices go down, supply and demand. How do they make up for that? They typically produce more, which causes prices to go down even more. Now imagine how a smaller farmer competes with that. They don't, unless they can grow organically or have a special niche. But it's even a challenge for commercial farmers. The other challenges commercial farmers face are environmental protesters, are neo-Malthusian-like people who are saying, hey, you're not being sustainable, you're dumping waste, you're wasting time, you're wasting resources, this is not efficient, or they complain for the treatment of animals in tight quarters and stuff like that. Here's a map of net exporters and importers around the world. Good news, bad news, kind of mix and match here. There's still a lot of countries that are importing a lot of their food, but it is a lot better than it was 30 years ago. About 30 years ago, the United States was the only country in the world as a major net exporter of food. We're now joined by about 40 other countries. That is very good news. Still have growing population, but we also have places that are being more efficient in food production. And then here is a fish production map. Something we'll also be talking about in coming days is a type of agriculture known as aquaculture. Actually, it's kind of separate, but it's about producing food sources. And obviously places with coastlines are going to be much more effective on this. We'll stop this video here. I'm going to do another segment on mapping and agriculture coming up in just a few minutes, but this will be able to break them up a little bit.